So the topic of immigrant crime reporting comes up frequently in discussion and debate about how local law enforcement agencies should be engaging with ICE and the Border Patrol, and what policies and practices should be adopted. I've seen this discussed starting around about 9/11 or around the time of the creation of ICE. And that's when the realization had really hit among the law enforcement community about the need for cooperation and especially information sharing with immigration enforcement authorities. And then a little bit later, after the creation of ICE, when they got the resources to do more enforcement and were able to more strategically put a priority on, and most of their effort on arresting that small fraction of the immigrants in our country who are actually committing crimes and getting arrested at the local level. And that's about when I remember seeing this raised more and more often as a concern. And especially when a program known as the 287G program, which allows for local law enforcement agencies to have officers trained and receive delegation of authority to enforce immigration laws. That's when we started to see this argument being put forward as a concern. You began to hear immigrant advocates start to claim that, well, look, immigrants are naturally more wary of police and therefore won't report crimes because they were afraid of police in their home countries. And so they argued if law enforcement agencies cooperate with ICE and share information, then there's going to be a chilling effect on crime reporting by immigrants. And some would go so far as to say, so, crimes will never be solved against immigrants because they won't be reported. Well, law enforcement agencies were always skeptical. They would say that's not what we see. We have robust community policing policies, and the benefit to public safety of sharing information with ICE outweighs the risk that people won't report crimes. But regardless, this narrative about immigrants not reporting crimes caught on despite skepticism from law enforcement and despite a lack of consensus, even in the academic research about this question. The National Crime Victimization Survey, which is the one that serves as the basis for our new report, before only reported about crime reporting based on ethnicity of those being victimized. But there were some other good studies done, one in Prince William County, Virginia, that looked at this question. But, there was not a consensus. And so now, as Mark mentioned, this idea of immigrants not reporting crimes as readily as other people in the community is the number one reason given for having sanctuary policies. And it's a dilemma for law enforcement. They want to encourage immigrants to report crimes, obviously, and they don't want to stop sharing information with immigration authorities. And they want to refer deportable criminal aliens over to ICE rather than release them back into the community. So most around the country have decided to cooperate routinely and robustly with ICE, sharing information, communicating, and so on. That is the norm for law enforcement agencies around the country. But there are a few big jurisdictions that have sanctuary policies that don't cooperate, where lawmakers have prohibited local law enforcement agencies from sharing information with ICE. So back to our study, that's why we think that the information is important. The National Crime Victimization Survey is considered to be the most authoritative source of information on victimizations and on crime victims, and notably different from some of the academic research that's been done. It asks a sample of people. If, first of all, were you the victim of a crime? If so, did you report it? And if not, why not? Along with some other information about the crimes. And until recently, they did not collect information on whether people were foreign born who were answering the survey or whether they were citizens. So until 2017, it wasn't very useful for examining these questions. But since they started asking the respondents if they were immigrants, if they were citizens, in addition to their ethnicity. Now, all of a sudden, we have a great way to examine these theories about immigrant crime reporting. So we obtained 3 years of responses, 2017 through 2019. And Steve and Karen crunched the numbers, broke down the data in various ways that Steve will tell you about shortly. To try to answer 2 main questions. Are immigrants really less willing to report victimizations? And can we detect a chilling effect based on state and local policies, whether or not they're sanctuaries? Well, if you've read our invitation to this event, you know the answer is no. Immigrants are, we find, according to this data, do not seem to be less willing to report crimes than anyone else. And Brian, if you could show the first slide that we have. This one's not in the report, but this is a representation of the crime reporting rates of on all types of crimes. And you see the blue bar, the first one on the left, is U.S. born. The green bars are foreign born or immigrants crime reporting rates, and the yellow bars are the reporting rates of non-citizens. Including Hispanic non-citizens, which we think is a good proxy for, that includes illegal aliens. And what you see is that these crime reporting rates for all crimes are pretty much the same. And Steve is going to talk about the details of these findings, but that's the basic finding. And as for this idea of a chilling effect, the existence of that, the NCVS DOJ database is not great for examining this question, but when you consider that most of the law enforcement agencies around the country are cooperating routinely with immigration authorities, that this finding that immigrant crime rates seem to be very much on par with other groups, this is pretty noteworthy. So when the norm is cooperation, and there does not seem to be a suppressed immigrant crime reporting rate. So what do we learn from this? Well, the theory that immigrants in general, or even illegal immigrants, are especially reluctant to report crime seems not to be true. That's great news, especially for those local law enforcement agencies that have been, really paying attention to community policing and encouraging crime reporting from everyone. So that's a real good thing to hear. And that means that state and local law enforcement agencies should not think that they need to cut off cooperation with immigration authorities, with federal immigration authorities, in order to encourage immigrants to report crime generally. It's still important to emphasize that by longstanding policy, as a general rule, victims and witnesses are not targets for immigration enforcement anyway. But it would be helpful, I think, to immigrants to hear from the advocacy groups that that this is true, that victims and witnesses are not targets for immigration enforcement generally. And instead of pushing this narrative that state and local law enforcement agencies need to cut off cooperation with ICE. I recently, the last time I testified before Congress in person, I sat next to a witness who was representing a group that advocates on behalf of immigrant victims of domestic violence. And she said that she advises her clients not to report their victimizations to the police because of the risk that they may be referred for deportation. And that seems, I think, to most people, obviously a really counterproductive thing to be doing. That, this message that victims and witnesses are not targets is the more important one. That benefits immigrants and immigrant communities and law enforcement agencies in going after the offenders. So let's hope that advocacy groups will start talking about that rather. And now that we have good, reliable evidence showing that really immigrants do seem to be reporting crimes as much as other groups in our communities. So now I'll turn it over to Steve, and he'll go for a little bit deeper dive into the numbers.